This is a short YouTube presentation on Chapter 5, the Integumentary System. So, really, integumentary system is the skin. Uh, it's uh, a large organ that covers our entire body, and it consists of three major layers. There's the epidermis, which is the non vascularized epithelial region that's found most superficially. It's supported underneath by a largely connective tissue region called the dermis. And then deep to that is the hypodermis, which is really superficial fascia. Um, it's mostly made out of fat, and there's a debate as to whether it's even should be considered part of the skin. Fundamentally, it looks like this, with the epidermis being a thin layer on the top, all along here, the dermis being the connective tissue layer that goes down to about there, and then the hypodermis adipose tissue down below. Like in this picture, it shows all the components that could be there, and the hair follicle and sweat glands and sebaceous glands and erector pili muscles um, and all of that. But we will simplify it quite a bit. So the epidermis, there's four different types of cells that are found in the epidermis, and because it's epithelium, it's avascular. There's no blood vessels. So the four types of cells are keratinocytes, which is by far the most abundant and gives the epidermis its properties. These are squamous epithelial cells that fill up with a type of protein called keratin. The keratin is a fibrous protein. It basically acts like a waterproofing. It makes the little cells fairly hard, and they end up resembling shingles. The outermost layer of the epidermis, the keratinocytes, are dead, and they are just basically still stuck together until they're shed. The next most abundant type of cell that's found in there is called melanocytes. Now, melanocytes are found fairly deep in the epidermis, in the more basal layers of the epidermis, and what they do is they produce a protein that's a pigment, and it's called melanin. Now, melanin varies from person to person, but fundamentally, it is the same sort of protein. Um, some people, their melanin is kind of a reddish color. Some people, it's more of an olive green color. Some people, it's more yellow. Some people, it's more kind of chocolatey color. Um, and in some people, it's even like jet black. It's really almost ebony in color. So those just are reflections of variations in the amino acid compound of the melanin, but it all serves the same function. What happens is the melanocytes actually produce this pigment, and then that pigment goes into the keratinocytes and stains them. And so the skin color is stained keratinocytes stained with melanin produced by the melanocytes. There's also some cells, they're dendritic cells. They're actually like macrophages, like fixed macrophages that live in the epidermis, and their job is to engulf any foreign invaders that are trying to get in. They're called Langerhans cells, probably because Dr. Langerhans found them first. There are nerve endings in there that are for the sense of touch. They're tactile nerve receptors that are called Merkel cells, and so it's for superficial touch. Now, we find the epidermis in some distinct layers, 4 or 5 distinct layers, depending on whether it's thin or thick skin. So thin skin, which is most of your skin, has got the deepest layer is the stratum basale, and this is the layer where there are there's mitosis going on. That this is the layer where new skin cells are formed, new keratinocytes are formed, and uh, and so these are the youngest cells in the epidermis. As we go up, uh, more superficial to the stratum basale is the stratum spinosum. And really, what's happening here is these are fairly young cells, keratinocytes, that are busy growing protein synthesis organelles. So, ribosomes, endoplasmic reticulum, uh, they're undergoing uh, the transcription phase of protein synthesis, not uh, they haven't actually started synthesizing many proteins. And so what they are, they're cells that are primarily filled with cytoplasm and not very much else at this point. They haven't had time to uh, to grow those organelles. They're in the process of it. Now, when you take a slice of this skin and you look at it under a microscope, especially with stain, what happens is these cells shrivel up because there's nothing that keeps them from shriveling up. So they turn into kind of like raisins. And uh, for the longest time, they thought that's what they actually were like in the living skin. It turns out it's not. They are rather plump. They're more like the grapes that the raisins were made from. Uh, so it's a bit of an artifact, but nevertheless, it's called the stratum spinosum because of that. Spinosum, spiny, wrinkly cells, and you can see it in these cells in this photograph here that they kind of have this wrinkled appearance to them, uh, and that's really because they're fairly young and they're empty and they're just making the organelles. Then above that layer is this layer here, and these cells, they're a little bit older. They were made a little bit earlier and they've been pushed up to this layer, and this is called the stratum granulosum because you're seeing granules of keratin in the cells. So these cells are actively making keratin and the cells are starting to fill up, but they're not completely full yet. So they are so you can see the granules. The granules actually take up stain, and so that's why it's the stratum granulosum. Um, the uh, the other organelles are starting to deteriorate because they don't they're not necessary anymore. Once you start to fill this thing up with keratin, it, there's really not a lot of metabolic demand on them after this. Then the if it's thick skin, there's a layer called the stratum lucidium, which are cells that are still alive, but they're completely full of keratin. Very thin little layer, but uh, but it's fairly distinct. And this is fast growing skin. So this would be the palms of your hands, the soles of your feet. So this is considered thick skin. Above that, all skin has the stratum corneum, the horny layer. Uh, Horns on cows and sheep and unicorns, for that matter, are all made of keratin, and so corneum means horn, and so this is the layer that is made of primarily of keratin, and there's a whole bunch of layers of really flat, dead keratinocytes that are completely filled with keratin, and they act like shingles, like a waterproofing membrane. Um, so from start to finish, this takes between 25 and 45 days to get from the stratum basale up to being shed off the stratum corneum. Uh, we're I've gone over this already, but the stratum spinosum, the stratum granulosum. So there's all kinds of granules accumulate of keratin. Keratohyalin is what it's really called, but what the hell. Um, the stratum lucidium is only found in thick skin, which I said, and there's keratinocytes in the kind of starting to die. There's, but they haven't completely flattened and dried out yet. So each one of the cells in the stratum corneum still has its adhering proteins, and so stay adhered until those proteins start to break down, and then they fall off. And literally, each flake of dandruff is a cell from stratum corneum. Same basic picture. So the dermis is the layer underneath. It's a strong, flexible connective tissue. It's made up of two layers, a papillary layer and a reticular layer. As the name suggests, papillary have got little fingers or ridges on them. Increases surface area. It adheres to the epidermis through the basement membrane, which is an extracellular material. This is vascularized. There's fibroblasts in there. There's macrophages. There's white blood cells. There's all kinds of stuff in the spaces of it that is all necessary for maintaining the epidermis. So the papillary layer is a very thin layer just under the epidermis. The reticular layer, which means net-like, ret and net are the same word, is where you find the blood vessels and everything else. So papillary layer, areolar connective tissue. There's collagen, elastic fibers. This is where we find free nerve endings and Meissner's corpuscles for touch and for pain. This is where the capillaries nourish the stratum basale. The reticular layer is 80% of the thickness of the dermis, and its strength and resiliency. There's some elastin in there that give it its recoil properties, and as skin ages, there's less and less of that elastin. If you think of leather is the reticular layer of the skin of whatever animal the leather comes from, so pig skin or lamb skin or beef hides, it's completely the reticular layer. Suede is the entire dermis. It's the reticular layer and the papillary layer still attached. And so when you think of the properties of leather, that's the properties of the dermis. There are epidermal ridges. They're even smaller than the papillary ridges, and they're for friction. That's what gives you fingerprints. The picture of it here. I'm not going to be worried too much about it. One of the interesting things about the dermis is that the collagen all goes along lines of force, and that what will end up happening is that that the skin is strong in the direction that it is normally pulled in, and it's weak in the other directions. So, for instance, and here's a map of it here. So, for instance, in the lower abdomen, you'll see that the lines of cleavage are all along on diagonals, but more in the around the lower ribs, they're horizontal, and that's to accommodate breathing. You can see these lines of cleavage in people that have stretch marks. What happens in stretch marks is that the pressure on the skin is in a direction that the fibers don't uh, protect against, and therefore there's little splits and scar tissue happen in the dermis, not in the epidermis. Um, the dermal layer is also the layer that takes the tattoo. It's largely connective tissue, which means extracellular matrix, which means that it's not shed and ink will stay there. You stain the dermis like a henna tattoo, or if you stain the epidermis, then that just gets shed away within a few weeks. Good surgeons know these lines of cleavage, and they try and cut uh, so that the so that when the wound gaps, it leaves a small scar. So if you cut along the lines of cleavage, it's better, um, and the healing is better. The scar is less noticeable. So I already said melanin provides most of the skin color. It gives the basic skin color, and it varies from person to person. It's like every family has their own recipe for melanin, and that's what gives your skin its basic tone. Um, if the melanocytes are evenly spread, then the skin tone is even. If it if the melanocytes kind of clump up, then you get freckles or pigmented moles. Another thing that adds to the color of skin is a pigment called uh, keratin. Keratin is actually called it because there's a high proportion of it in carrots. Uh, it really is a fat soluble pigment that comes in our food, in vegetables specifically, in orange or yellow vegetables more so than in green vegetables. And it starts to accumulate in the skin, and it'll stain your skin. And you can see it in the palms of your hands, the soles of your feet, because there are relatively few melanocytes there, so the keratin becomes the predominant color, and it's what gives that yellow tinge to the palms of your hands. It's why calluses tend to be more yellow than other areas, because the epidermis is thicker in those spots. The red of the hemoglobin, really, the red blood cells in the capillaries of the skin also add the color, and that's what gives its skin its pink hue. So, so your skin is some sort of a combination between keratin or keratin, um, the melanin, and the hemoglobin. Um, Now there can be other things that color the skin, but they're more found in pathologies. Like um, the hormone ACTH will accumulate in the skin and give it a bronze color. And those sorts of things are much more indicative of pathological things. But from a normal physiology point of view, it's the three. There are a number of appendages of skin that um, derive from either epidermis or dermal cells, but it's mostly epidermal cells, and they tend to be glands. So the sweat glands, oil glands, hairs, and hair follicles, which are really keratinocytes with a different sort of keratin. Fingernails and toenails are keratinocytes with a hard version of keratin rather than the softer version of keratin found in hairs and the rest of the skin. I'm not going to go into any detail on any of these things, just realize that they are derivatives of the epidermis. They're epithelial in nature. Um, and so, sweat glands, there's two types. There's the merocrine or eccrine sweat glands, palms of your hands, soles of the feet, your forehead. This is that glistening sweat. It's mostly water. There's a little bit of salt. Uh, they have their own pores, and this is that sweat that will glisten all over your body. And it's mostly used for thermoregulation. You use to evaporate it off your skin and cool yourself. Um, it's also the nervous sweat for a lot of people, and it is like I say, it has its own pores. There's glands. The glands are found in the dermis, but they are epidermal in origin. They migrate down into. They grow down into the apocrine sweat glands. These are found in your armpits and in your crotch area, uh, and the sweat that uh, they have is really connected to the hair follicles, and there are various proteins and fats that are dissolved in it. This is where scent comes from. This is where BO comes from. There, uh, there are sebaceous glands too that really have this sweaty substance. There, these glands will even specialize more and make earwax, and they're called ceruminous glands, or they will make milk, and they're called mammary glands. So these sebaceous oil glands all over the place. They're in the hair follicle. So any place where there's hair, you'll have a sebaceous gland, and it secretes this oily secretion. Uh, the secretion does a bunch of things. One of the things is it keeps skin soft and supple. It keeps hairs soft and supple. Keeps them from becoming brittle and fracturing. Um, but there's also uh, there's also antibiotics, bactericides that are in it, and so it helps really keep us safe. Too much of it is called seborrhea. So they're here right beside the hair follicles. I'm not going to worry about hair, but they are basically keratinocytes arranged in kind of a tubular arrangement, basically like this, and it's pretty much like the same sort of thing, like a stratum basale that has um, that is undergoing mitosis, and then the keratinocytes that are slowly making keratin and pushing the hair up from the hair follicle. Uh, it is interesting that the drawing and the photograph are even the same color. It's actually a very good drawing. I'm not going to worry about hair follicles at all. You can peruse this if you have an interest. Nails are very similar. What nails really are this layer of keratinocytes that grow from the nail bed at the root of the nail, and the keratinocyte is a hard keratin. So what does the integumentary system do for us? It keeps the inside in and the outside out, and it forms some barriers. We already talked about these barriers when we talked to immune system, but it performs chemical barriers. And now this isn't keeping chemicals out. These are chemicals that are secreted by it that protect us, like the sebum. The fact that most of the secretions on the skin are acidic, so that inhibits bacterial growth and that kind of thing. There are mechanical barriers, physical barriers, which basically is the keratin and the fact that these cells are stuck to each other. Um, Biological barriers are the living cells, that the macrophages and the dendritic cells, the Langerhans cells that are actually in the skin, forming a biological barrier to anything. We use it to regulate our body temperature. If we're too hot, we sweat. If we're too cold, we move blood away from the skin. So we use it to radiate heat. We use it to, by not radiating it, we use it to conserve heat. This is also where we have sensation. This is where the sense of touch, pain, temperature sensation all happens in the skin. Skin is our interaction with the outside world. Vitamin D is synthesized in the skin in response to sunlight. Um, it's made from cholesterol. Now, it's not full vitamin D that's made in the skin. It's the precursor to vitamin D. The vitamin D is actually activated in the kidneys, so um, kidneys are necessary to this as well. It also protects us by converting harmful chemicals into things that um, are less harmful, and it does this through metabolic functions. We use it as a blood reservoir. If we need more blood someplace, we take it from the skin. If we need less blood, we put it to the skin. Um, Anybody who's ever spent much time in a sauna understands that there's excretion. We lose a lot of waste through the skin. We lose some salt, but we can get rid of various metabolic waste, especially nitrogenous waste. Um, all you got to do is sit next to somebody who's been eating a lot of garlic, and you know that there is an excretion function to skin. Now, the rest of the slides from here to the end of the thing are either um, disorders, so it's either pathology, or it is developmental, so we're not going to be doing them. So that's a quick, less than a half an hour video on Chapter 5, Skin.